Hey, you, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Hippie podcast. I'm your host, Michaela, and as always, my co host, Willie, is right here by my side. And today we are so, I want to say like shocked, but in a good way to share my book with you. And I say shocked because there's a part of me that I still can't believe it's out here. But if you're on the video, I'm holding it here in my hands. There she is in all of her realness. The barn off of Colfax Lane. I explain in the interview with Kenley the differences between why this book ended up being its own book. But if you listen to the last episode, you know originally the book was supposed to be titled Be Fucking Brave. And so all of that is explained in the episode. I'm going to keep this intro short and sweet and read a couple pages and then just let you listen to Kenley and I's conversation. And what was really special about it is Kenley is one of my best friends. She knows me so well. And the questions she asked, I was not expecting in the most beautiful way. And it wasn't just direct book questions. It was really about the writing process, the behind the scenes, like what I learned along the way. So I'm really excited for you to listen to this episode. So Willie and I are going to read you a couple pages from the book. I linked the book to purchase off of Amazon below. And then from here, I'm going to read and then just go right into the episode with Kenley. So I hope you enjoy. If you have any questions, you can I didn't talk about the pen name in the book. I'll do another episode on that. But if you have any questions for me or questions about the book or need help with the purchase link because Amazon's being a little funky, you can email me at michaela@michaelamae.com. And lastly, before I read these pages, I just wanted to thank you for being on this journey with me. Some of you guys have been with me for years. And you know, maybe this is your first introduction to me. And I'm just either way, I'm just so thankful you're here and on this journey with me. So thank you. And I hope that this book, reading this book brings you as much healing as writing it did for me. I've spent almost, I'm going to do a whole episode on this, but I've spent almost $30,000 on different healing modalities and personal development. And writing this has allowed me to leave the past on the pages like nothing else has. And so I wish I would have had this book when I was going through all of this as a kid. And yeah, I really hope it brings you as much healing as it did me. So without further ado, I'm going to read you a few pages and let's get into the episode with my friend Kenley Tai. So if you have the book, I'm just going to put this in a part that makes sense. This is on page 27. Even when I know nothing about something, a sport, hobby, craft, anything really, and I've never seen it done before, I can tell if someone is good at what they're doing or if they're terrible at it. I don't know why I know the difference even when I watch something new to me, but I do. I can remember being able to see talent or lack of talent since I first took swimming lessons. I was still in diapers, but once I got old enough to form an opinion, I could tell who could swim well and who would have their arm floats on in the kiddie pool for a very long time. I never wanted to be the kid stuck in the kiddie pool or in her arm floats, so I pulled mine off early against the instructor's advice. I told the instructor I didn't like them and they hurt my arms. Most people won't argue if something hurts. But the truth is, I would have drowned before I became one of the kids stuck in the kiddie pool with my arm floats on longer than necessary. Even at 3 and 4 years old, I knew there had to be a quicker way out of the kiddie pool, so I removed all flotation devices as soon as possible. If I recall correctly, I became the youngest kid to swim unassisted in my class. I think that means I did something right. The day I watched Todd ride his mare for the first time, I saw just how much talent the two of them had. Plus, Todd did show off a little bit. While in the spin maneuver looking thing, Todd wrapped his reins around the horn of the saddle and completed the maneuver with his arms crossed in front of his body. I had no idea what I had just watched, but I was memorized just by how good the two of them were. Watching Todd and his mare also made me realize that riding Vegas had turned me into the kid stuck in the kiddie pool with her arm floats firmly around her biceps. I wanted out of that darn kiddie pool and I wanted the darn arm floats off of my arms. I committed to learning everything I could from Todd and his new mare, so I studied their rides each time Todd rode her. Without further ado, here is my episode with Kenley Tai, and the barn off of Colfax Lane can be purchased on Amazon and is linked below in the show notes. Thank you. And I will talk to you at the end of the episode. Yeah, so I wrote a book. And the book turned into 3 books. So yeah, the first book. So originally it was going to be one book titled Be Fucking Brave, and the one book was going to have three different sections. And it was a really interesting moment, actually. I was in this office when I wrote the last sentence to what is now the first book. So the one book that was going to be three parts has now turned into three books. And the reasoning was the book kicked off with 12-year-old Michaela. So the books are all written from the perspective I was then, the age I was then, from that perspective. And when I got to the last sentence, I started crying, which, as you know, it takes quite a bit for me to cry. Like, I'm not one of those people who cries over, like, as I get older, I would say that it's easier for me to cry. Like, I'm more tuned into, like, instead of fighting them, I'll let them come up more. But it was odd. Like, I wrote the last sentence. I don't want to give it away. And I started crying. And I was like, oh, this is done. And I'm sure, as if you've ever had thoughts that came into your head that you weren't expecting, I'm like, oh, this is done. I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, what? This is only the first section. There's two more sections. Like, what do you mean this is done? And it became apparent that this needed to stand on its own. And one of the reasons that it made sense was, so the first book is now titled The Barn Off of Colfax Lane, which was originally part one. Um, Part one and part two had a lot of repetition because part one is the sexual assaults I was going through with the horse trainer. And so it's 12-year-old Michaela telling her story. Well, when we enter part two, which is titled Be Fucking Brave, which was the original title of everything, we enter the book with the detective coming to my house to interview me about what had happened. So in the interviewing process, it was all redundant. It was me explaining. There were a few things that chronologically didn't come through in the first book. So there actually is more details about the assault in the second book than in the first book. I really felt like 12-year-old Michaela needed to have her own thing. Like, I really, kind of that I now call it my banger year. Like, I didn't really realize how hard of a year 12 was for me until writing the book, because the sexual assaults was really the end of my 12-year-old year. I left the barn in August of 2008. I turned 13 September of 2008. And then in writing the book, I realized how the year started was I had switched schools for the first time in 9 years, or however long you're in elementary school. I went to the same elementary school. I had the same teacher for 2 years. And what I didn't realize until I wrote the book was that the classroom, we went to a really small school. We all knew each other. We felt like a very dysfunctional family. And a lot of the needs I wasn't getting met at home was getting met through this classroom and through the teacher. And like, this teacher we had, shout out to Mrs. Jones. She would get us cards on our birthday. She would get us candy on our birthday. Even after my first horse died when I was in her class, like, she held me when I was crying. Like, I mean, yeah, I mean, we were family. I've known all these kids almost my whole life. So then we enter elementary school. Not only does the teacher suck, but now this dysfunctional family went our separate ways because we were all in different classrooms. And I didn't realize how hard that was on me until I wrote the book. And that stuff's not actually in the book. It didn't make the cut, but I did write it for my own processing. So I'm finally getting adjusted at the beginning of my 12-year-old year, like, to this school situation, emphasis on the shit. And um, my childhood dog dies in November of that year. And so Hootie was 3 when I was born. And I was 12 when he passed. So he was about 15 going on 16. And it was catastrophic for me. I mean, he slept under my crib when I was a baby. He slept with me. I mean, he was never not with me. And so just coming home without him was just awful. And so that was the beginning of my 12-year-old year. And then the end of my 12-year-old year ended with these sexual assaults. So I now call 12 my banger year. And so, having wrote that last sentence to the barn off Colfax Lane, I really just felt like 12-year-old Michaela needed her own space and needed her own story, for the world, apart from all the rest of this stuff. Like, the other stuff in the book has its, like, big stories. And I think she would have got drowned out by that a little bit. And so it really felt like this just needed to stand on its own. And in doing that, it also gives me time to finish the rest of the stories. Because I promised myself when I started out on this journey, I would write the book until the story was done. And as I kept writing, it kept getting longer and longer and longer. And so this gave me an opportunity to get 12-year-old Michaela's story out, but then also honor her story and then also honor myself now and giving myself the time to not rush this book because I really wanted to get a book out soon. And so this kind of was a win-win for 12-year-old Michaela, for me, Michaela. And then the third book, which I'm not going to talk a lot about that, is called The Perfect Victim. And it'll really like dive into the patterns I believe, I guess, spoiler alert, made me a victim not only once in my childhood, but twice. Like the patterns I saw in myself. And I wanted that to originally, like I said, I was going to finish the book with that, but I really wanted that to stand on its own for multiple reasons. So that's how this thing became a 3-book series. It was originally supposed to be 1 book. And yeah, here we are.
I know, and I don't know if you want to touch on it in
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
review, but I know you'd mentioned your trip to California too with the police report and how that affected you. Do you find, did that end up in the first book at all?
No,
Or
but
is that
I do
mostly in the
think it
second?
is important to talk about. Yeah. No. So yeah, I forgot all about that actually. So yeah, so I wrote the book from 12-year-old Michaela's perspective, was had almost I was almost done with 13-year-old Michaela's perspective, but I had finished the police stuff. I just hadn't like finished. I ended up going through the court trials at 13, like the end of my 13-year-old. No, I was almost 14. Yeah, so I was almost done with all of that, but had the police report section done. And I decided to call the police station and ask to get the actual police report back. A couple reasons. I wanted to see what if I forgot anything. And I also wanted to see how accurate my memory was, like in a really weird way of was I actually recalling these events well? And it was kind of freaking freaky how well I remembered them. Like, because there are holes in my memory. And I kind of thought those holes developed over time, but actually they were there. And so the way I remembered it and the way I wrote it, like it kind of freaked me out comparing them side by side. And um, sometimes, and Kenley can vouch for me, sometimes Michaela jumps headfirst into the deep end of the pool and doesn't think about things. So I did when I got the police report back in my mind, I was just confirming my side of the story, if you will. I have never heard the horse trainer who I use pseudonyms in the book for legal reasons. He's Todd in the book. So I'd never heard Todd's side of the story. This will all be in the second book, actually, but ended up doing a different court case first. I kind of referred to that of getting sexually assaulted twice by 2 different people. They ended up taking the non-horse trainer case, the babysitter son case to court first. And then by the end of that, I was so tired, we settled for a plea deal. And I'd never heard Todd's side of the story because we never actually went to court. So when I got the police report back, it was the first time I'd ever heard Todd's side of the story. And that was kind of the other reason to split it into 2 books is I didn't realize how much it was going to rock me to hear his side of the story. And a lot of these things will come out in the third book, which will be The Perfect Victim, because my assumptions became truth. And that was a really weird space for me because like I said, I had saw these patterns and they were assumptions as to why I was, and this is the title, right? The perfect victim, quote unquote, like why he could groom me so easily and why I wasn't going to tell, like all of these things I had assumed, but then they were proven true in the police report. The only difference is he used them to say why I was lying. So in the police report, he was saying, this is why Michaela is lying. This is why she's making up this big story. But him and I both know it's the reason, like, because he saw all of these things. That's why I was, quote unquote, a safe target for him, because the likelihood of me telling was just less and less, because there were these holes in my family life. There were these gaps within me that he could go in and fill so that I would feel whole with him in a lot of ways. And so, um, yeah, that I needed to take a break on the book after reading that for a couple of months, but still wanting to honor myself and getting a book out. That was the other reason. It was like, okay, I feel like I could get, because I don't need the police report for this first part of the book. So it allowed me to keep working on something while I was processing this police report that I had never wrote or read until what, 15, 16 years later.
There's one other question that came to my mind
Yeah.
regarding the police reports, and then we can go back to the first book if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
But when you said like your assumptions became truth and then he used those against you to prove why you were lying, how did that feel to process that?
You know, I was actually listening to an interview yesterday and I think I'm going to borrow her words. Her name's Teal Swan, and she went through a bunch of like ritual abuse and crazy, crazy things. And the guy that had groomed her, crazy story, I'd never heard of it, was training her for survival skills. This was his story to her. And so he would chase her in the woods, like on a mule or, um, on ATV or something like that. And so then when she had to go through the processing, what she said was, I had to, because they present it as we're helping you. They present it as we love you, and processing how in danger you actually were was kind of a weird, that was like how she said it. Like I had to process that I was actually in danger because I was getting chased by a psychopath. Like he wasn't actually training me on these survival skills of running through the woods. Like this was what he was using to get off. That was Teal's words on her experience. And that was like, oh, the way he groomed me was that he loved me. And so to like kind of face that was a weird, it's still weird. And I'll tell you why it's weird for me is because even though he was faking that for grooming, my care for him was not fake. And so that is like that hard gap for me to fill in my own self of I actually did care about him. And there's a piece of me that will probably always care about him. And, you know, some of the things that I still use if I ride horses today came from him. And so that's kind of the hardest part to wrestle with is the love and care that he used as a game was never a game for me. And that's been the hardest alligator to wrestle with, if you will.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that perspective up because I think a lot of people, when looking from the outside in on a lot of child, predators, people who prey on children, what we fail to realize as adults is that these emotions and feelings are very much so real for that person. Like it's not just a, oh, this is so cool, I'm with an older person. Like, no, those emotions develop within children. It's no different for a child who has their first crush than an adult who has their first crush. Is those emotions are really real.
Yeah.
um and being able to sit with that and understand and be empathetic for any child who deals with this, that they're not just going to get over their, I don't know what you would want to call it, but the person who abused them.
Hmm. Yeah, and denial of those feelings will block you from healing. Like, you
Mm-hmm.
know, we talk about the processing of the negative emotions, but the processing of the positive emotions can be just as hard in a lot of ways because um
Mm-hmm.
he and I talk about this in the book, but there's one line that I wrote in the first draft, which I've told you Kenley is now titled the rage pages. Like some people call it the shitty
Mm-hmm.
first draft, some people call it vomit draft. I called mine the rage pages because I just had so much anger that I needed to get out. And it was like the mind pretzel of one of the lines I wrote. I don't think it made the last cut was he would kiss me in moments that would be cute if it didn't involve a minor in a 67-year age gap or like whatever that was. And so that was like a weird thing is like I'd never had a grandfather. My grandfathers had all passed before. And so it's like he filled that role of a grandfather, just to like betray that trust. And so those emotions are almost easier to accept. Like, of course, I feel betrayed. Of course, I feel hurt. But then the confusion is kind of the next layer of that. And then I did actually care about him. And that if it was anybody else but him, that would have been a really sweet moment. And the other part is maybe that was still a really sweet moment. It was just also effed up. But then when you've been groomed and brainwashed, you almost can't tell the difference. And that, um, but when I avoided, like, because originally I was not planning on talking about any of this, both in the book and here now, of the positive emotions I felt, it was like, I can't move on because then I'm almost blocking myself from feeling these positive emotions with anybody else because I'm afraid they'll lead me astray. But it's like,
Mhm.
no, you were just led astray by a very perverted man.
And I would imagine it creates a feeling of isolation when you can't sit and process those. Like, I think there's a large expectation from everyone else in society that it's like if someone wrongs you, your mentality should be like, screw that person. And almost this hate filled perspective then towards someone who does you wrong. But at the same time, not being able to show that, hey, despite this wrongdoing, there's still a lot of emotion in here that's not anger and that's not hatred.
Mm.
And having to suppress that is almost just as gut wrenching as expressing and feeling the other.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, I don't know if I've ever talked about this publicly, and I don't know if I think you and I have talked about this before, but I went down a rabbit hole probably 7 years after the fact, after like everything happened, after the court cases were closed, of what would cause a human being to do this to another human being. Because again, I didn't understand the betrayal, I didn't understand the shock, like, and so I went down a rabbit hole of, okay, how does a human being do harm to another human being? And I kept coming back to the first step is always dehumanizing them. And I will say now, for my own self, diving deeper into the trauma work, there's a dehumanization and a rationalization that very much are doing a dance. Like they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Like if I do something wrong to you, I have to rationalize that you're a bad person so that I can justify it in my own mind. And dehumanization is one of the ways to do that. So if we look historically, the Holocaust, World War II, they weren't people, they were Jews. If we look at slavery, they weren't black people, or they weren't people, they were black, they were the N-word, they were slaves. There was a stripping and a cut of these people are not humans anymore. And as so at that time when I'm going down this rabbit hole of dehumanization, I'm still calling him the rat. And I started calling him the rat because I could not, from like 12 to 15, probably, I could not say his name without clenching my jaw, without chipping my tooth. I mean, I chipped a tooth clenching my jaw so hard one time because I had to say his name for court stuff. And because you have to state the perpetrator's name and blah, blah, blah. And I mean, it was just awful just to speak his name. And it's kind of Hermione says it in Harry Potter, like fear of a name only increases fear of the thing itself. But I was dehumanizing him. And at one point, like I was dehumanizing him to get my power back, right? Like it was a power thing. And I'm not saying this like bad Michaela, don't ever do that. I'm just saying when I went down this rabbit hole of dehumanization, I realized like I had to stop dehumanizing him even by calling a rat because it became a refusal to play the game. Like the buck stops with me. And even though he did some terrible things, I'm still going to see him as a human because how I believe we do one thing is how we do everything. And if we justify it in this purpose, then we're going to justify it in a Holocaust sense. We're going to justify it in a slavery sense. So like someone has to stop the buck. And so I started when I would tell people my story, instead of calling him the rat, I would call him Todd. I would say his name. And eventually it was like, it also helped me as I could say his name in a weird way. It also helped me like that was something that happened. It's in the past, but it's not now. But that was a really interesting journey that I went on that I see in a lot of victims. They come up with names for these people. And I think by us doing that, it actually still allows them to hold power over us because we're adjusting our behavior for them, to them. And so that was like a really interesting journey of processing too, of the dehumanization piece. And like, just because he dehumanized me, I'm not going to play the game and I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that to you, regardless, because your actions don't, and we've talked a lot about this, like your actions don't get to dictate who I am. And yeah, that was a really interesting processing piece too.
Well, and from that, we've talked a lot about generational trauma and all of these things that may not be our own, but that we have the opportunity and the blessing, if you want to look at it at the light end of things, to break these, you know? And it's the same thing when you experience trauma within your lifetime. It's like you have this this deciding factor. We call it like a friction point in the military where you get to go one path or the other. And your two options in this scenario is to become like the abuser and those abuser tendencies with that manipulation, dehumanization, and building out that likelihood in order to survive, or you break that chain, like you were saying, where you stop the buck. And so I would just like to say I'm in awe of the person that you are today and the awareness that you had, even at a young age, if it wasn't actively cognizant of like, oh, I'm doing it because I don't want to be that, even if it was just like, ooh, I don't like the person that I'm being, so I'm going to change it for the better. That is so beautiful, and it has led you to where you are today.
Yeah. And I do want to give, some people would call it God, some people would call it the universe, whatever you want to
Mhm.
call it is. And I'll talk about this more in the second book. He put an avatar, if you will, a character into my life who had went through something very similar and never healed. And I think because I didn't know her, because when you're inside the family and the generational trauma, it's really hard to see it. And so sometimes we have to have somebody come from outside to really kind of poke it in the face. And he had put someone into my life that had went through this, and had asked her to take care of a horse for me because I had a court date to go to. So I was 14 at the time. And she said, "Oh, what do you have to go to court for?" Because it's kind of an odd thing that a 14-year-old is going to court, especially like, I was a pretty straight and narrow kid, if you will. It wasn't like I would be going to a juvie thing for something. So it would catch people by surprise. And so I just gave her kind of the outline of the story. And she's like, that happened to me when I was younger. And she's like, I hate him. And for some reason, I could see the control it still had over her 25 or 30 years later. And I didn't have the words for it then. But I remember hearing God say, if you don't heal from this, that's you in 30 years. And I don't like labeling things good as bad, but I'll just say she was a person I didn't want to be. So shout out to the man upstairs for that one.
I think the flip side is also this is a coin that neither side is easy to navigate, because it's like I think neither option is better than the other, but for myself experiencing my own, sexual assaults at different times throughout my life, it's like you can come out of it hating the person or not feeling ill towards the other, but that pendulum is going to swing. And you're going to have moments where, despite not having ill feelings, you're going to have anger and hatred at one point in time, one day. It's going to happen. And then the flip side, where you might be filled with the anger and hate, and you're going to swing over and find that balance of having good emotions towards them and not feeling ill towards them. And I think eventually what we're trying to work towards is just that middle ground where it's like, I no longer have this visceral emotion towards their presence.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that metaphor because, like, as you were talking, the images that were coming to my mind was to make the neutral be homeostasis. And it doesn't actually
Mm,
mean we won't like leave neutral because, like, as I was writing this book, I'd went to the anger side of the pendulum more than I had gone to in years. But then I came back to neutral, right? And maybe even a stronger neutral than I ever had because I was able to um, process some of the anger that still lived in me. Um, yeah, I love that metaphor because yeah, it's like I still go to the anger. I still go to um yeah, more the anger side of the pendulum. Let's not beat around the bush here. I'm like, I don't really go to the other side of the pendulum very much, but like, yeah, I would go to that anger side or that fear side, but then, and I still do, I don't think, but if I can come back to homeostasis, that neutral position quicker, or live there more than I live in the like, you dirty son of a bitch, that's that's ideal. And I will say for me, it comes up the most in like romantic relationship pieces of that's definitely where the anger will still come in more.
well, and I'm curious too, because you and I have done different inner child walks and
Mhm.
explored the, I mean, just the fact that you've written the book alone for your 12-year-old self is kind of a showcase of that. But I think maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the care in that opposite side of that pendulum may reside within your 12-year-old self or your younger self. And then that anger is that anger that your older self feels for not having a protector there for that piece of you.
Mm. That's interesting because actually, when we were talking about the pendulum, I didn't know what was on the other side. Like, I could only see the anger piece of it. And when you use the word care, it actually gave me a perspective shift in real time because that is what's on the other side. Like, because I knew what it was like for someone to use care as a weapon, if you will. I did now know how to use care from like a very genuine place of I'm not looking for anything from you. And
Mhm.
so now that you're talking, I actually do go to the other side of the pendulum more than I give myself credit for. Um, because caring and loving for somebody without any strings attached, it's probably, if for me, it's the best gift you can give somebody because I know what it's like to have um the opposite. And so I do like whether it's with the animals, I do go to that side more than I give myself credit for. Yeah, I probably would use the anger for the protection because, it was a man at his most beautiful and best is a protector and a provider. And so to use what's supposed to be safety for a woman for inner gain is pretty perverted, literally. So yeah, yeah. I would say most the anger comes from when it comes in is definitely from the betrayal because we were close. Um, I did see him as my grandfather. And that, like I said, I didn't have both my grandfathers. My parents had me. My mom was like 37, 38. My dad is 8 years older than her. So 46, 47. My grandparents had just passed. And so it would be like most people my age is like great grandparents were the age of my grandparents. So yeah, because I didn't have the words back then for provider and protector. I think we know it intuitively because maybe that is the betrayal of the person that's supposed to protect and provide
Yeah,
did the opposite.
I think that for any child who's experienced, whether it's sexual abuse or neglect, where you're just not getting your basic needs and your emotional and your cup filled, if you will.
Yeah.
It comes down to that betrayal of like you were supposed to protect me as an adult. You were supposed to provide for me those
Mhm.
basic necessities, and when they're not there, it is a betrayal. Even if, like you said, the child doesn't have the words for that, that's the emotion behind it. And
Mhm.
then as a child, you start filling in that narrative. Oh, I they didn't provide for me because I wasn't good enough. They didn't provide for
Mhm.
me because I didn't do this enough, or I didn't achieve this, or they weren't proud of me. And I'm curious if you had to break down any of those narratives yourself from your 12-year-old self, having experienced that.
Yeah, I mean, still in a lot of ways. This happened because I'm a bad person was a lot of it. And also that, so at that point, that would have been the second assault that I had experienced. And so definitely there was a belief of I'm only good as like for a sex toy. And that was kind of just hard stop. Um, Still working on that. Um, my perfection wounds, I think, were not from that, but that definitely did not help future stuff. Like this made me having this as like a bookmark in my past made me a less perfect person.
Mhm.
Let's see what other my worth wound has been a big thing of yeah, just again, my worth was kind of at the level of a sex toy, hard stop. So and this is what we'll talk more about in the perfect victim, but it's and this is what I want, and this is my whole intention of writing The Perfect Victim so parents can see this stuff, because I don't think we talk enough about the unconscious and how a kid's brain from the second trimester to when they're 7 years old is in a theta brain state, which is a hypnotic brain state, and we don't get the alpha brain state until we're 7 coming 8. It's forming, and it's not, like, fully installed till we're 8. And so we don't realize that kids are just it's like watching belief. There is no filter of, "Does this make sense?" And so how all the stuff in my family, like, fed in, like, the family beliefs and the family patterns, like, the generational trauma, if you will, how it all bled into the situation. And so I come from a family of workaholics. I come from a family of addiction. And so believing that our value is in what we can do and not who we are definitely fed into again, I don't think it stemmed from this, but it definitely amplified it from the sexual assault, but it definitely, like, amplified it and made it more ingrained in some ways. If I can do this for you, I'm lovable, not like who I
Mhm.
am makes me lovable. So that has been something that's constantly come up, the betrayal, trusting men again. You and I have talked about it, but Allison Armstrong's work was definitely huge in my healing journey because it gave me a new perspective of men, um, how they could
Yeah.
be providers and protectors and not, pigs, I guess, for lack of a better term, and I'll be doing more content on this, but I was raised from a line of women who didn't do well with men. And I had a shirt, which, like, it disgusts me to say now, but I had a shirt made for me, given to me by someone in the family that said boys are dumb. And I would wear it to school. And that was my belief, right? And so it's like this very interesting thing of like what we want, we're calling stupid, and then we wonder why. It's like, well, no, I'm not going to be with you if you're calling me stupid. I wouldn't want to be with somebody who's calling me stupid. And so I
Mhm.
already like have this foundation of beliefs of men laid down, like, but as a child, my dad was my hero. So it's like definitely these conflicting beliefs going into the sexual assaults, and then the sexual assaults happen and it convoluted so much in my head of like what I thought about men, but then also I had these beliefs, but then all my best friends growing up were boys. And so then, we come into Allison's world and read Keys to the Kingdom and the Queen's Code, and I've read her book Making Sense of Men. I've taken her Making Sense of Women course. Like, oh, we're biologically different, and there's ways we work with people, and it gave me a lot of healing too because she talks in the Queen's Code about how sexual trauma is like men and women's instincts colliding at their worst. A woman's like high desire to please a man. And I actually don't remember the men's high need. Do you remember it by chance?
I don't.
I know that's kind of interesting that I don't, because it was a woman's need to please a man colliding with a man's, I think it is a sexual desire or sexual need or something like that. And it's like the peak of them clashing. And so from an instinctual piece, that definitely really helped me understand like why, even as I was going through this hellscape, like why I was trying to still please him. Um, I mean, I think Yoda said it best, like, you must unlearn what you have learned. And so it's been sexual assault or not, it's been a process from 12, I would say, from when I turned 12, 13, because my quote unquote healing journey started when I just didn't want to hate the bastard. Like that was kind of the term I used at 12 and 13 was like, I just don't want to hate the bastard because I don't want to chip another tooth was the big thing. And, my jaw would hurt and like there was all these things. And so that was like the first step in my healing journey. And then I got into like the brain work and the somatic work and all this stuff. And I'm like, oh, it's really just an unlearning, but it's not just around the sexual assault. It was like all these beliefs that were installed in childhood. And I feel like I'm still, the book let me look at my story objectively for the first time. I went from, it was just a thing that happened to like, holy crap. Like that was a mind pretzel. It was a roller coaster in a mind pretzel. So if there's a roller coaster shaped like a pretzel, let me know and I'll go test ride it to see if it's accurate or not. But that's like really, yeah, I feel like I'm still in it in a lot of ways. And accepting that there's always going to be new layers to it has been another processing. And that I write about this in the introduction of this book is like, my problem is not that I have ghosts in my closet. Like, we'll go with skeletons in the closet. I think I used the term ghost in the introduction. Um, we talk about coming out of the closet, sexuality or spiritually or all these things, but like we all have skeletons in the closet that we have to come out of. And this is just another one of my closets. It's another skeleton. Everyone's got them. And so back to that perfection piece, the fact that I have them is not the problem. It was the fact that I would try to hide them
Mhm.
or deal with them on my own in the name of perfectionism. That was the problem. So I guess throughout the writing process, there has been a big acceptance piece as well of we've all got skeletons. And, again, thanks to Allison, I thought really gave really good tools in her book of how to deal with the skeletons of going, considering going back into the dating realm, if you will, of no, you address this stuff on the first date. And if it's not
Mhm.
going to work on the first date, it's not going to work on the 10th date, and it's not going to work on the 100th date. So get it out now and even get on the phone and get it out before you even consider meeting in person if you meet like online or, whatever. And having like those tools definitely has brought me peace, not only in relationship, like romantic relationships, but in friendships too. Like, yeah, if this isn't going to work now, it's not going to work then. So, long way to answer is I think it's just always going to come in layers. And
Mhm.
yeah, yeah, leave it at that.
You said something earlier regarding Allison's teaching, and what I find interesting is both you and I have struggled to sit within our feminine. There's
What are you
no
talking
hiding
about?
that we can attach to a masculine energy very easily. And I'm curious, side note, I'll circle it back, but I want to finish with this one
Yeah,
thought first.
yeah.
But you'd alluded to having to work for love or having this free limiting belief that love doesn't come naturally because of who I am. I have to work for it. And what Allison also highlights in her book is to be in the feminine is to not work for love, not seek out attention from others, but rather sit within yourself and allow it to come to you, because men are
Mhm.
drawn to a feminine spirit, and femininity is found within self. It's not found externally.
Mhm.
Um, so I wanted to kind of go back and
Yeah.
highlight that piece, that what you said. I think that's part of why you and I struggle with the sitting within the feminine for so long. Because I certainly growing up had that limiting belief where I have to earn love. I don't deserve it because of who I am or just existing. Like I have to do something for you to validate me and then want to love me. And then going into dating, it's like we've also had this conversation where it's like, I need to fulfill your needs, whatever they are, even if it's engaging in sexual behavior that I'm not yet ready for. I need to do that for you in order to be worth loving and worth protecting. And then circling that back to the protecting piece. Shoot, I should have written this down because I'm starting to lose it.
No,
But just,
you got it.
I think seeking outward and being that masculine to be our own protector in those areas felt safer than being within our feminine. Um,
Mhm.
so I'm curious if, how do I want to phrase this? If, oh, hold on, I'm losing it.
You got it. Hard work,
Yeah, so it has to
working for
do.
love, feminine. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It might be gone.
Invite the train left the station and we were not on it.
Oh yeah, I was
Um,
definitely not on that station. I guess I'm curious if that, we kind of went over that, so I don't think it's that. I don't know. What do you think about that piece?
well, I think that was interesting because even this morning, as I was like getting ready, because that's like to produce is a masculine
Mm.
trait. It's a masculine, and so even this morning, I was just like rushing, and like even just as you were talking, I'm like trying to get all these things
Oh
like
yeah.
hunting, right? And it's like, no, you're a gatherer, dude. And so it's really funny because there are certain aspects of my masculine or being in the masculine energy. Because yeah, you're exactly right. Like if the masculine men around me are not going to protect me, I'm going to protect myself. Um, and arguably, so this is actually an interesting thing I've observed. Again, we'll talk about in the perfect victim. Um, Men that abuse are in their feminine because manipulation is a
Mm.
feminine um trait. And before everyone just jumps out of their seat, these are
Mm.
instinctual things. They're things we needed to survive primitively. In the two some million years humans have existed, our DNA has not changed. Like we can pretend like these instincts are still or that are not there, but they're there. And again, we're just gonna love on Allison all podcast long because she's amazing. But to
Yes.
quote Allison Armstrong, I don't argue with the way things are. I figure out how it is and I learn to work with it. This is how it
Uh-huh.
is. It's so good. Like this is
It
how it
is.
is. This is how our brains work. And to deny it is a dismissal of ourselves and it's counterproductive, quite frankly. And so, manipulation, men had their physical strength to protect themselves, women had manipulation. And manipulation could be I can't fight this bear, but I can out trick this bear. I can out hide this bear. I can out. So, again, not good or bad. It just is. And so, for me, I, yeah, I mean, it was, and I was even thinking about that the other day of me choosing to be single for as long as I have is also a form of control, right? It's controlling like who has access to me and who doesn't. And
Mhm.
behind that control is the masculinity piece of like, I don't trust you to protect me. So I'm just going to keep protecting myself. And so I would argue that might be the biggest piece of someone who's experienced any kind of sexual assault is you can call it vulnerability, you can call it protection. but it's really working on that trust and safety again. And I think, again, for me at this stage of my life, knowing that part of that work is going to come within a relationship. Like, I can't think my way through those wounds. I have to work on those within a relationship. And so, um, and
Ah,
I think, yeah.
yes.
hmm And I think just acknowledging that sometimes is really helpful of, and I had this with, some of the work I do back to the perfection wound. It's like, it's never going to be perfect. And you get to a point where, yes, I want to
Mhm.
be far enough ahead of people that I can help them. I want to be, um, there were certain wounds I wanted to work on outside of a relationship. I knew that for a long time.
Mhm.
I talk about this more in the second book, Be Fucking Brave, but had entered my first relationship when I was 19. And the title of that chapter is I'm fine. Everything is fine. And then the quote underneath it is from Two Broke Girls of like, fine does not mean fine. The scale goes, I hate you, or like, I love you, you're good. I hate you, fine. Like, fine is like at the very last
Mhm.
scale. And it was this confronting of I was not fine. And there were those things that when those things came to the surface, I did want to work through those by myself. But now I'm to the point where it's like, dude, you can't work through these by yourself because your issue is not a
Mhm.
singular issue. It's a duality. It's a relationship issue. So, um, I don't know. I do think just being honest. I keep coming back to just being honest and like the communication skills we've learned through Allison's work of these are my issues. If you do not want to, like, if this is going to be an issue for you, um, bye. Like, and
Yeah.
it's not like, and getting rid of those scripts. If we go back to the worth wound or the other, getting rid of the scripts of I'm not worthy of someone dealing with this. Like, I don't want to deal with this. So how can I expect anybody else to deal with this? Like, no, deal
Mm.
with it.
Mhm.
And there's going to be someone who, because what you and I have talked about, like, someone could come with us with an issue and we would never say, like,
Yes.
now there's probably going to be some issues. It's like, yeah, I'm not the partner for that. Right.
Yeah.
But,
But it's never a wrongdoing on them. It's just like, hey, this is outside of my realm and scope of capacity of what I
mhm,
can assist with. You might
right.
find someone better matched. It's never
Yeah.
a wrongdoing on them or a scar
hmm
on them. But for us, when you flip it around, it is a scar on us.
hmm
Which, that being said, you've cued the train. It came back to the station and I was on board this time. And it was exactly actually what you ended up going down the piece. Because right before I brought up the Allison and being within your feminine, and we were talking about love and having to earn it, we were talking about
hmm
baggage and how this is like a skeleton within your closet. And um, it was exactly that, the luggage and being carrying it around and then feeling like no one's going to love me because I'm now carrying this around like I'm unlovable because of this scar. um
Yeah.
and I know I carried that around at a really young age,
hmm
and it's not an easy emotion to sit with. Like, not only am I unlovable,
hmm
um because I don't work hard enough to earn this, or whatever limiting factors you create. I'm not perfect, but on top of not being perfect, now I'm also carrying this external scarring, if you will, of like, hey, not only am I not perfect, but I've also been abused. So now I'm not worthy of love because I'm tarnished in a way.
Yeah.
And like, I carried that around, but without the consciousness of knowing about the tarnishing.
hmm
And I know that feeling was amplified for me at 20 when I experienced another event myself. I can
hmm
only imagine putting yourself back into 12-year-old Michaela's shoes and carrying around that feeling.
Yeah. There's a line in the book um that was a very real thought that I had. So one of my favorite things about the book, and I didn't write this, so I typed it, but 12-year-old, this was 12-year-old Michaela. So go girl. They're called call out boxes, but there's these boxes in the book that's actually me arguing with me, myself, and I. um, because I don't think we like to talk about this, but there's multiple voices inside our head. And it's like, oh God, if we talk about this, someone might deem us as schizophrenic. And I'm just like, whatever. It is what it is. And these are very real arguments I was having. And so, one of the things that people do with grooming, and I explained this more in the second book because the detective had explained it to me. So, the goal or the intention of writing it through the perspective and the age that I was that we were going through this journey together. I love Harry Potter, and very much like the first Hogwarts book, like Harry didn't know about the wizarding world. So we were learning about the wizarding world with Harry. I very much wanted it to feel like that. I wanted to feel like you were dropping in with me and we were going on this journey together. And so I do explain this more in the second book than in the first book. Again, first book, The Barn Off Colfax Lane, is very much just Michaela's story. It's a very common grooming tactic, which is what happened with me to me of they will do something and then wait. And in that waiting time, this is where the dialogue and the call out boxes like start coming in is, oh, it was just an accident. So you start justifying it. And then because so long took place, um, it really feels like it was just an accident. They didn't do it on purpose. And then they're also waiting to see if you're going to say
Mhm.
anything. And if you don't say anything, if you dismiss it, like it makes them more comfortable with doing something else again. Like there's less, it's kind of a benefit consequence thing. Like, okay, if she doesn't say anything, if she doesn't do anything, like I got a better chance at continuing to act out things without her going to tell somebody or him. People experiencing this in general. We'll talk about this later, but I actually do think more boys are molested than we know. It's just not okay for boys to talk about. And so my hunch is that more boys actually get molested than girls. It's just not talked about. So sorry guys for just saying her in that situation. But so the first incident happened and I don't think anything happened again. This is where like the holes in my brain are for another like 2 weeks. So the first incident happened and I remember looking in the mirror and it's in one of these call out boxes. And I very much have a transition about halfway through summertime. So I go from being a pale, like dirty blonde to a very tan, very blonde person. I still go through this transition every year. And there's always like a turning point where it's very noticeable, because you kind of slowly tan. And I hadn't looked at myself just I talk about this in the book. We would hay farm during the summers. And so it was like a really long process or just a tiring process. So you didn't really have time to stop and look at yourself in the mirror. And so the first incident happened. I got sick to my stomach and asked to be off work for the rest of the day. So I go home, lay in bed, and I get up to go to the bathroom. And I keep, like, the first incident that happened, he had grabbed my left boob. And I keep like looking down at my boob and I keep looking up in the mirror. I'm like, there's no way that happened. And it was like the first time I'd got a catch of my reflection like all summer. And I'd realized like how tan I'd gotten, how much lighter my hair was. And I kind of remember looking at myself and like cocking my head. I'm like, maybe I'm pretty, but I'm not that pretty because there was very much this belief like I was friends with guys, but like guys don't like me. I'm not a girl that guys like. I didn't fit what Allison would call the perfect person. Like I very much had this persona in my head of what girls get guys, and I did not fit that persona. And so I'm like, there's no way this happened to me because I'm not pretty enough for it to happen to me. And so that was very much a dialogue, like even 12-year-old me was carrying. Like, and underneath that, to what you were referencing, is I'm not pretty enough to be lovable. I'm not skinny enough to be lovable. I had the blonde hair going for me, right? Like, but um, my boobs weren't big enough to be like all of these scripts that are in our culture, that are in our movies, they're in our books, like all of these things, I very much even at 12 was carrying around with me. So yeah, I'm
Mhm.
not lovable because I'm not pretty enough. So yeah, even at 12, again, when you're that age, it just is. But then reading that present day me, reading back on that, I'm like, holy crap, that was a heavy it's not just me, like, it's a heavy baggage. I don't think adults realize how many kids are carrying that around. And even again, these are call out books as these are dialogues in the book, but like within our culture, like how much pressure, because that was like one of the things that progressed was he started kissing me, and even like the pressure to be a good kisser, and like I'm not lovable because like it was awful. And so like as a protective mechanism, I started like biting my lip. Yeah, we can go into this, I guess. But like, so one day he was old cowboy, like he used chewing tobacco. And so I would like, as events would start happening, he would kiss me and I would dissociate. So I very much would leave my body to not have to like fully experience things. And so one day he like breaks away from my face and I was like, God, there's something in my mouth. And I swallowed, like not really thinking about it because I hadn't fully come back into my body yet. Like if you've never experienced dissociation, it's very much similar to that first 5 minutes you're awake. Like you're very drowsy, you're very out of it. So you almost don't realize like you can't fully feel your body. So I felt something in my mouth, but I didn't know what it was. Well, so I he had somehow put his whole glob of chewing tobacco in my mouth and I'd swallowed it. And so because of that, I started biting my lips so that his tongue had a harder time getting into my mouth and a few other things. And even then, how much shame I felt for not being able to like kiss him back or not being a good kisser. And like when you look at like teen movies, how much pressure there is to be a good kisser and to be like, if you're not perfect the first time you kiss somebody, if you're not perfect the first time in bed, like you're not lovable. And so I was carrying all this around even at 12.
Um, I'm curious because you've mentioned before as well. So you took
Mhm.
us kind of into the barn, I'm
Yeah.
assuming is like where some of this was going on. So you've
Mhm.
taken us down that path. And then also you've mentioned pieces about the court case. Is
Mhm.
there anything else that didn't make the cut for the book, but might be worth mentioning in terms of your journey throughout 12-year-old Michaela's life and the writing process?
Mm. A lot of the which I did put the bangerier stuff in the introduction a little bit. I just didn't go like fully through it in depth. Um, some of the assault pieces aren't mentioned in the book because, like I said, chronologically, I couldn't remember them. And so it didn't really like, there's a piece in the book where present day me pops back in because from like late Jaloon, late June. That's Jaloon. That's a good one. Late June to August. That's when my brain is very much like that's where the holes in my I call it the Swiss cheese parts of my memory. Like that's very much where the holes exist. And so there are pieces of the assault that aren't in there, but they are in the second book because I'm telling the detective. And so I had said to the detective, I do not remember things in chronological order. And he's like, it doesn't matter. Like, you just need to tell. So those pieces didn't make it, but they are in the second book. Um, there are stuff with the family that I ended up cutting out until the third book because I really wanted to lay that stuff out in the perfect victim of the family patterns. I
Mhm.
also there's a lot of like there's a lot of interesting stuff that comes out, I guess, with book stuff. So it's like you're already dealing with kind of and I tend to deal with the fear of success more than the fear of failure. Um, and so there's a lot of like emotional stuff, even just putting a book out into the world. And talking about the family patterns was not stuff I wanted to deal with in the first book. I wanted to wait and deal with that in the third book. I really wanted to get my first book and second book out, kind of get my feet wet with not only just writing a book, but launching a book. So a lot of that stuff got cut for the first book, but it will be in the third book. So the only thing that really got like cut, because the first book is very short, it's about 18,000 words. Um, the whole book's about 22,000 words. It's about 100 pages. Um, because there is a sneak peek of Be Fucking Brave at the end of the first book. So when you buy the first book, you will get a sneak peek of the second book. Um, so yeah, I don't think that is coming to mind. There's nothing that got cut that won't be somewhere. Like it'll either be in book two, it'll be in book three. But yes, I did cut some stuff out of book one, partially for redundancy, and then second, With getting this book out, there were family stuff that I did not want to deal with until I got my first couple books out, because the third
Um,
book's probably going to cause problems.
and I'm curious because we met in college,
Hmm.
in a communications class, which I was absolutely terrified in. But one thing that we had in common was writing and the enjoyment for writing. And I remember you also telling me about your creative writing class you were taking and arguing with the professor over certain things.
I
And
would
I
never.
remember I remember you expressing an interest in writing a book at some point. And this was years ago. I've been in the Marine Corps for 3.5 years, and then this was probably 2 years before, about a year and a half before I decided to join.
Hmm.
Um, so close to 5 years ago, which is insane to think about.
Bananas.
Oh,
Hmm.
I'm curious going from there to now. I feel like within yourself, you knew that you wanted to tell the story in a book
Hmm.
format.
Yeah.
What did you think the purpose of telling your story was back then versus when you actually applied pen to paper? What did it turn out to be? What do you want this book, someone walking away from reading this book, to learn?
You're gonna love this one. That was a really good question. That was an awesome question because you're gonna love this one. So I started writing this book in 2019, which was when we were in class.
Mm,
I'd started writing two books in 2019 we were in class together like January to March or April was like first semester. April, which oddly enough, we're in April, is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so I did this. There was two photos and two videos I would post a week, and I like really went into this stuff.
mhm,
And at the end of April, and I was also in Brazil to go see my film school best friend who lives in Brazil. I went to, and it became very evidently clear. I'd already started writing the other book. I started writing that in like December or January of, I think I started writing that in December of 2018, and so continued to write it. And I was just writing it by hand. Like I had a journal, and every night I would write. I would see how I write is this book was a little different. This is why I say I don't write the books, I just type them. Um, this book was a little different. I didn't see anything, I just heard. Like I heard 12-year-old Michaela talking to me, and I was just like writing what she or typing what she was saying. Um, Fiction books, I see the scenes in my head. I don't know if this is from my film school days. I don't, but I would see the scenes and I'd write them. So I'm writing this fiction book. Um, this is where I do relate to Taylor Swift very much so, or any artist really. It was me processing that first relationship of was writing this fiction book. So I would see the scenes in my head and I would write a page a night just in my journal. So then we go to April and it became very evidently clear I needed to write a nonfiction book as well. And I don't know why, but I knew I needed to get the nonfiction book done first. Don't know why. I still don't really know why, but even now I feel like that's why it's so important for me to get these three books out first. And then I will go as of right now, because I don't identify with much. Like, I don't really like wearing huge identities. A writer is one thing I will identify with. And it very much feels like I need to get these three nonfiction books out. I'll go down a fiction writing career, and I probably won't write nonfiction again until my second, another memoir comes out, is intuitively what I feel. Also, who knows? Because, again, sometimes I just jump off diving boards without asking how deep it is. And so who knows? But so I get to the end and I'm like, I have to get this book out. And where Be Fucking Brave, we're gonna be really interested to see if I can recall this from memory. Um, March 25th, 2015. I was hit a depression. It was one of the worst depressions I'd had. And this quote pops up and it's like old school Instagram. Like I kind of miss this Instagram. And the quote was, say how you feel, leave the job you hate. Um,
mhm.
Say how you feel, leave the job you hate, say things that matter, stand up for things that matter, love with every ounce of your bones. I'm missing a couple lines. And then it's like dot 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 and then it says be fucking brave. And so I knew even back then the title of the book was Be Fucking Brave. And in fact, the cover of that book is from one of those photos from 2019 because I'm like, this book came to me 2000 in 2019. I really want to honor. And the photo my friend took of me, I don't usually love photos of myself, but I really love this photo. And so I wanted to use it. And so the opening of the book is I've started and stopped this book 3 or 4 times. There's 5,000 words in one document, 10,000 in another, and 20,000 somewhere else. And a part of me knows the smartest thing to do would be go back, find those partially written drafts, and continue on. And the other part of me knows that I need to start here on this blank document. And then me being a smartass says, like, well, blank 68 words ago. And the point was, like, when I started writing it in 2019, I was still so disconnected from feeling it and from the emotions because my friend Kimberly at TK Stretching, who has helped me with so much healing work, I've worked with her for like 2 years, has also, and she's talked about this publicly, also went through sexual trauma. And so there's this weird thing of when you're experiencing it, you dissociate. And so when you heal from it, you actually have to feel things for the first time because when you're dissociated, you never actually felt them. And so when you heal, you actually need to be in body and feel these things. And so I was so still disconnected from those emotions around that. Dude, the book was so disconnected. Like it was such a lecture. Like I'm going to be really dramatic here, but this is what it felt like. Like I went through sexual assault. Now I'm okay. You should be too, the end. Like it was so just detached from how I actually felt about the situation. And I was like, yeah, some guy grabbed my fucking tit. Good job. Like it was so detached and so disconnected. And it's interesting because my joke is my brain broke in 2020. I think it's a funny joke laugh. But it,
I think it's so funny.
yeah, yeah. And so it caused me to go on this emotional healing journey, right? Like I went and did psychedelics. I got into more
Mhm.
emotional therapy. Like I went, and in hindsight, I may have started the book in 2019, but from 2019 till now, I became the person to write this book. So
I
that's,
love that.
yeah, it's been a journey. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I could not have wrote it from 12 like these different parts of me. The psychedelics, the work with Kimberly allowed me to be able to go tap back into these parts of me to understand how they were feeling, what they really went through, instead of present day me writing as if I was watching a movie that I had never seen. It's like, no, honey, you are the main character.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And I want to circle back to another piece, but I'm going to save that pin for later. So I'm going to write this one down because I will forget it.
that's a great question.
Um, Sorry. My memory, it used to be good and now it's trash.
I'm still healing the brain,
Mm-hmm.
which is why
Yeah.
my blue tongue, it's supposed to help brain stuff. So,
I think uh that's one thing you and I share is 2020 breaking our brains for completely two different reasons, but one and the same. It's broken.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
2020, the year my brain broke. That'll be in the second book.
Oh, yeah. And it has nothing to do with COVID.
Mine does for sure.
Oh, well, mine doesn't.
Yeah,
At least that I'd like to admit.
you're right. Yeah.
Um, how did 13-year-old Michaela feel about a plea deal? Because I have some feelings about a plea deal, but I want to hear about 13-year-old Michaela's as well, and then present day Michaela.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So I got my dates wrong. So it probably would have been 14-year-old Michaela that did the plea deal. Because yeah, I think it would have been. I'd have to double check because the only reason I kind of remember this is I went through the first trial August of 2009, right before I turned 14. And then we had to write, and this was kind of where I learned that writing would help me process things,
Mhm.
is we had to write, the teacher gave us an option. We could either take a hint of the truth and exaggerate it, or we could just tell, but there had to be a piece of the truth in the story. So, like, one kid in class was like on a tricycle when they were like 4 or 5, but they made it sound like it was a motorcycle crash. But then at the end, you find out they just tipped over their tricycle when they were like 4 or 5. But even interestingly enough, talking about it, having done the inner child walks and inner child work we've done, knowing that that probably is how the 5-year-old actually saw it, which is really interesting to think about. But
Mhm.
so yeah, that was the only contingency on this paper we wrote. It had to be one page, and the truth had to be in it somewhere. I didn't need to exaggerate the truth to make it more interesting, fortunately or unfortunately. And so I wrote my paper on the court date, and that was for my 8th grade year. So the plea didn't happen till after that. So yeah, I was probably at least 14, going 15. Um, at the time, I didn't care. I was so tired. There's a hint of this in the first book. It's more in the second book. The assault that happened when I was young was with my babysitter's son. And my babysitter's my babysitter herself was like a second mom to me, and emotionally was more emotionally available than my own mom. So like if I had to cry, I went to her. Like when I was a kid, I was terrified of the toilet, so she would let me throw up on her back instead of um in the toilet because I was so scared. And the irony was like my family owned a dry cleaner, so she would just put my throw up in the bag and just hand it off. I was like, "Yeah, I may have let her do it, but you're cleaning it up." And so one of the things that I was kind of holding on to was that I was going to have her through this court stuff with the horse trainer. And the only reason I told the detective about the stuff that happened with her son was because I watched a lot of Law and Order SVU, and I didn't want them to find out somehow because at the time, some of my friends had known about it and the detectives were interviewing my friends. And so I didn't want the detectives to, if my friends thought they needed to tell the detective this part of the story, I didn't want it to come from them. I wanted it to come from me because I didn't want to jeopardize the case with the horse trainer like at all. So I was like, that was one commitment I made to myself the day the detective was driving over to my house was you tell the whole truth. Like, hopefully this won't come up. I didn't think it would come up. I thought it was in the statute of limitations. Like even at I would have been 13 when the detective came over to the house. Like even then I was like going through all this in my head. I was like, okay, the statute of limitations should be out, like blah blah blah. So the detective did ask if anything like that had ever happened. So I just told him, not thinking anything would happen. They decided to take that to court. And because it was an older case, they took that to court first. And she still had like some child care stuff going on. So they wanted to make sure no other children would be in the house, like blah, blah, blah. That was exhausting. I mean, that court, it got delayed, it got postponed like twice. It would have been about a year-long process. And I essentially lost. I don't see this way now, but back then it was like losing a whole section of my family. And so that
Mhm.
was so exhausting. And I mean, and having, and again, like having someone I loved so much and still love throughout this process. Like I remember praying to God, like, she knows I'm honest. She knows I would never lie. Maybe she'll still be in my life somehow. Like, all these stories you tell yourself, especially at a young age, hoping you won't actually like lose this person. Um, Having her like hate me, like watching her like look at me like through the other side of the courtroom, like she lied about me on the I stayed in the courtroom the whole time, like she lied about me on the stand, like it trashed me. I mean, I was wrecked. I was exhausted. I was just because it's not just the court stuff, it's staying up late worrying about the court stuff. It's, the other stuff that was going on at home. It was, we had horses and stuff, which at the time the horses were my saving grace, but like My mom had a boyfriend that sucked at the time. Like there was all these other things going on that I was just exhausted. So when that case concluded and they offered a plea deal that I did not have to go to court, like he was willing to take it then and now, I was like, dude, sign me up. Um, what they didn't tell me exactly was they had dropped it. So Oregon had just passed. I want to say it's called Measure 9. I don't remember. It's Measure 9 or Measure 11, to where all sexual assaults were like a lifetime sentence. And so he would have got like 200 years in jail. And at that time he was already 80 or whatever. Um, they had dropped it to get him to take the plea. They dropped it to attempted sexual assault, and he got 30 days in jail. I don't remember being fully briefed on that. I just remember them saying he'll take a plea deal, and I was like, done. Because had I known he was only, even being that exhausted, had I known he was only going to get 30 days in jail, I think I would have gone through it. I don't, because I do not remember being briefed he was only going to get 30 days in jail. And I do not remember being briefed that it was going to be dropped to attempted sexual assault. Um, I also don't know. I knew he was going to be more vicious in court, like as bad as, my babysitter, the babysitter was. Hearing her son lie on the stand didn't really bother me. It's like, I knew you were gonna lie. So like hearing him lie about me, um, the the attorney tried to like make me out to be I think it's called a scorned lover. Um, because he had got married
Yeah.
that yeah, he got married that year, so they were trying to make it look like I was being vindictive against him. I'm like,
Yeah, children are very vindictive.
yeah, like I remember the attorney looking at me. He's like, "So I technically could have objected to all that, but he's like, you were making them look so stupid. I just let you go with it." I'm like, "Thanks, buddy." Um, it's just kind of interesting even saying that out loud. It's like, man, even the detective didn't, or even the DA who like cared deeply about me kind of just let me handle my own fight with another man, you know. Um, he did his best, but it is kind of interesting because that is an issue I've had about like men, not other men in my life, like not protecting me. I'm gonna have to go sit with that after this podcast. But um I was just so exhausted. And so, but I don't know. I think had they told me it was attempted, they were gonna drop it down to attempted. I think I would have still went through it. Now that was how I felt about it then, afterwards, and for a long, long time. I wished they would have taken the horse trainer's case to court first. I wish Todd would have got more days in jail. And then when I went and did my MDMA psychedelic sessions, I finally felt peace about how it went. And the reason I felt peace with how it went is I only remembered one instance happening with the babysitter's son. It's actually, it will be in both books because the only reason I think my brain allowed me to remember as much as I did with the babysitter's son was my body, I believed, was trying to prevent me from getting raped again. Like I believe that's why my brain allowed me to that memory to resurface. And maybe it just started resurfacing due to the nature of what was going on. I don't fully understand that. Um, and so there's a reason it'll tie in the first book of why I brought that up in the first book. Um, I only remembered that one instance happening. And so I was really upset. Like, one, it had happened so many years ago. It didn't feel like it had an effect on me anymore. So I was like, why did we waste all this energy taking this to court when I really wanted to take this one to court and put the energy into that? Then through my psychedelic sessions, learned it did not just happen one time, it went on for years. And so I felt like me going to court with that was me taking a stand for all these years that I had um forgotten. Like, and then it had become clear like other kids were getting molested at daycare, And so I actually had a lot of peace with that because even though it was a judge trial, essentially the judge didn't like me. So he was not guilty on both charges. There was like two charges. I can't remember either. Think it was I think it was rape of a minor and I think it was sexual assault of a minor. I think were the two charges. Um he was not guilty on both charges. But then when I learned about like everything that had through the MDMA, so it's how MDMA works. So if you mushrooms, if you take mushrooms, they're more than your unconscious mind. Like you can feel the energy from plants and trees, and that's why like in the 70s people would joke about people on mushrooms like staring at trees. MDMA is just your memories. It's just your unconscious. And so it's not being influenced by anything outside of you. Like it's very much within you. There's a bunch of great resources on maps.org, but that really helped me feel peace about it. Like I felt like at that point, 13-year-old me didn't just go to court for that one instance that happened. It was for the other kids that it happened to. It was for the years that I had forgotten about. So with everything, there's very much been a journey of there was deep regret from, and both my MDMA episodes are on the podcast. I wrote my reports up, my trip reports is what they're called, and I read them on the podcast. But so it's been a process of anger for sure, of why did we waste all this energy? And then by the time I did my first MDMA session, second MDMA session in 2022, I finally felt peace about how it went. I was like, okay, I wasn't just like, as terrible it is to say, but it's honest. Like Todd's old. Like I think God kind of straightened out that one. He ended up getting in a car wreck and it's like he's still alive, but like he's in a home and had his kind of freedoms taken away physically because somehow he was still going at like 90 and then had gotten the car wreck. And so I'm like, God handled that one. I didn't really have to, I did my part. So, but I think the babysitter's son was arguably still more a threat to other little kids. And um, even though he came up with the not guilty, like everyone in his family, whether people want to say this or not, it's always going to be in the back of your mind, you know? So if people around him have kids, hopefully there's at least a little bit of I don't believe he did that, but I'm probably not going to let him go in the room with, that's my hope, I guess. But again, that's kind of stuff I can't carry and have to hand back over to the big man.
Yeah, I think I can't imagine letting someone go, but I, I know that that's more common than not,
Mhm.
especially when it comes to he said, she said cases, um, which is oftentimes why people don't report. And I do also know because I've experienced the flip side of that. Having a lot of men in my life who have been wronged and who have had women lie on their name. Like I've seen the flip side, and that's equally as sad and heartbreaking to see because in either stance, whether someone is lying on your name, accusing you of something you haven't done, or someone takes away your control over yourself, they're both losses of control. They're
Mhm.
both fear enticing. They're both power taken away from you. And but to see a child doing that, it's
Yeah.
much more rare, I would say, for a child to come up with this crazy story about being, sexually abused,
Yeah.
um, and want to go to trial for it. So having adults kind of observe that and then abandon the child, not just having your own
Yeah.
family abandon you, but then other strangers abandon you throughout the process.
Yeah, and that's been surprising to me because the original detective who had interviewed me for Todd's case said that he never thought I was lying. And that detective was, I mean, he's amazing. I still keep in contact with him and check in on him every now and again. because he was a family friend as well. But he small town stuff, I tell you, man. Um, but he said that most people that are lying don't make it through trials. So like he doesn't really waste his time because he's like, if you're not telling the truth, you're not going to get through this process because it is hell. And that was, I
Mhm.
think that this line might have got cut from the book. It's probably going to be in the second book. I think it is in the second book, but like my world crumbled and the only thing I had left to stand on was the truth. And that really was the only thing that kept me going was that inner knowing that my babysitter's son, my babysitter, they were lying, but I was telling the truth. And that was the only thing that really kept me going was my word. And so it's been interesting to me watching the cultural stuff of women lying because that was very evident to the detective. And mind you, this is 2008, so 14, 16 years ago. Um, they just weren't worried about it because they're like, you won't make it through the trial process if you're lying because it is hell and there's postponements and postponements, and people that lie don't tell their story straight. And so, um, that's been an interesting phenomenon to me because I actually, some people would disagree with me. I would rather see a predator go free than an innocent man locked up for um, being wrongly accused. And yeah, I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I have an issue with the fact, like, we've got men that are afraid to even give their women friends a hug because of this concern, because it's just malicious. I mean, to accuse someone of a wrong they didn't do and having like gone through that, you're hurting the people that actually did experience this, right?
Mhm.
And
Oh,
so,
yes.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're just making people who actually have to go through trials, you're just making their word weaker. And I have a big problem with that, especially because there's more, there's a ripple effect to more than just you, right? And yeah, so that was interesting to me with the judge, yeah, not taking my words seriously, and that's why I don't want to, like, with the ADA not really standing up and saying like not objecting, like that does bother me a little bit, thinking about like you were just kind of letting a 12-year-old take the punches and not saying like, dude, hey, this line of questioning is actually not allowed. But I also don't want to really beat him up too bad because um it both cases happened in two different counties, so it was two different ADAs, two different detectives, two different, and my legal team, if you will, was amazing. Like the ADA was amazing, the officers were amazing. The one officer that I said I still keep in contact with, he's just awesome. And the ADA, I mean, he really did his best. And he, afterwards when, he was more bummed than I was, I think, about the not guilty verdict. And it was just kind of like I could tell he was bummed. And I just like walked over. I was like, "Can I give you a hug?" I'm like, "You did your best. I did my best." Like, if the judge didn't believe me, it's kind of interesting because my attitude was like, "Ah, that's his problem." Like, I was kind of like, "Screw you, dude." Because I remember when it's a judge trial, the judge goes like guilty or not guilty. And he technically doesn't have to explain why. He was explaining where my reasonable doubt was. And he was saying like some parts of one of the things my babysitter's son did was he had showed me like a porn magazine and was showing me like I was so young, he was essentially showing me what intercourse was, and he was saying like, "This is what we have to do." And I remember the judge saying that that was just so far fetched, that would never happen. And I was just sitting there like, yeah, because
Mhm.
pretty sure back then it was pretty common for young boys to have porn magazines in there. Like he went into his brother's room and got it. Like I remember all that stuff very vividly. So yeah, no, it was an interesting experience because I'm like, the judge didn't like me, which was um yeah, very fascinating.
Well, and what's interesting is you and I have also talked about human design and
Mhm.
your piece of human design being that people will often project perceptions of you
Mhm.
onto you.
Mhm.
Um, and oftentimes they're negative in connotation,
Mhm.
what they're projecting onto you. And what I find interesting, not only does that kind of go in alignment with what you're saying, where a grown man, a judge who's there to be somewhat of an unbiased mediator within court cases is still fulfilling that prophecy of, projecting onto you whatever connotation he has as a child, mind you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that there are things that adults, especially when interacting with children, can forget, where they'll become out of tune with their childlike selves.
Mm-hmm.
Because I even can recall a memory of a teacher I didn't particularly like, and they projected a lot onto me as well,
Mm-hmm.
negative connotation wise. And
Yeah.
I remember him accusing me of something,
Mm-hmm.
and I started crying because we sat there for like 5 to 10 minutes of me explaining my case very similarly of like, hey, I didn't do this, this is it. And I said it very level tone, very even keeled. And after he continued to ask the same questions, I started crying and I was like, I didn't do this. And his response was, well, you had to have done it because if you didn't do it, you wouldn't be crying. And in my head, I was like, it's kind of what we were talking about at the start, where it's like having your own assumptions used and twisted against you
Mm-hmm.
in that type of manipulation tactic. And then we've discussed too
Yeah.
that being like, oh, well, those men are in their feminine, they're in this
Mm-hmm.
manipulation and this mind game type of mentality where they can't, men are quite matter of fact. They tend to be more black and white than women. Not all, but they tend to be like, oh, the ocean's blue, the sky's blue, this is what it is. Whereas women are like, don't you see the gray? The sky's not blue because it's also purple and pink and it has sunsets and sunrises and it's great. There's all these other things. To write it off as blue is like telling half the story. Um, and so I think when you have these men that are just writing something off of like, oh, well, yeah, he couldn't have shown you porn at an age because that's too crazy. That's too wild. It's just like you aren't sitting within your actual masculinity of like the facts, the black and white. Here's the story. And you're allowing yourself to be deceived.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like, I mean, even Allison describes it, and I don't want to take her writing out of context, but she does say that men can sniff out a lie from 100 miles away, essentially, where it's just like if you try to BS a man, if you try to fabricate something in front of a man, they're going to be able to detect any fakeness towards them.
Mm-hmm.
Which is also why in her book she describes like not living untrue to yourself. And I think you and I have seen that as well, where it's like you can tell men standing within and sitting within their masculinity versus not because they're more easily deceived when they're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And women taking ownership of if you're in your masculine, you're more likely to attract a feminine man. And most relationships, or I see where a stepdad or someone is molesting their children, the woman's in her masculine, the
Mm-hmm.
man is in his feminine. And the other thing that's going on is when a woman gets into her masculine, she's disconnected from her intuition and cannot pick up on whether she's with a dangerous man or not. She can like only
Mm-hmm.
see the seen and not the unseen. And it's the unseen where this is at. Like on the surface, Todd was a very good old cowboy. Like he'd been in the same town for a ton of years. Everyone that knew him loved him. And
Mm-hmm.
so then that was one of the reasons I was so terrified because I was like, there's no way anybody's gonna believe me. But then when I said it, people saw it. So it's like, well, how can we see it before someone says it? And to me, that is where intuition comes in. And then also learning how to not need to justify it because I didn't like Todd when I first met him. And I like going
Mm-hmm.
back to adults putting stuff onto children or like dismissing children. I was called judgmental. I was called uh uncompassionate, I suppose, because one of the reasons Todd had started giving lessons again was because his wife of 50 some years had passed. And so he had trained horses, I think his whole life. I don't know that he ever had other jobs other than horse related jobs. Like a lot of struggling horse trainers, it's not uncommon for them to also shoe horses on the side or work at auction yards, like just kind of anything to pay the bills until they get a clientele built up. And so he had done like bull riding and like odd jobs like that. But I think he always, from what I recall and what he told me, always had worked within the horse industry of some sorts. And so then he got his clientele built up and he was very well known like locally. Like so he had got out of horse training to take care of his ill wife. And then when she passed, had got back into it. And like when the town, and I talk about this in the book, when town had got word that he had started training again, like his barn filled up because there was no good colt starters around. And I remember when I first met him, like right after his wife had passed away, I did not like him. I didn't like him at all. There
Mhm.
was something about him that just, and when I said, like, I don't like him, I was dismissed. Like, you're being
Mhm.
uncompassionate. He just lost his wife. He's not with himself. He's not. And going back and realizing that now, it's like, I would rather not like somebody. Like, if my intuition just says stay away, I would rather stay away
Mhm.
than get too close. It's kind of a give and take, but like, no, someone, I would rather be proven wrong that the person is actually good and we're just having an off day or something than have a feeling and dismiss it. Because just definitely
Mhm.
going through this situation, watching, kind of going back to the generational trauma and other things, like I would rather have my intuition be fine tuned and wrong than have it be right but not trust it.
Yeah. I think you and I have discussed intuition extensively.
Mhm.
And that's one thing both of us have taken into consideration is we will oftentimes sense things that others don't. And anytime we live out of alignment from our intuition is when we're bitten in the ass, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good mentality to be in because it's self-abandonment when you walk
Yep.
away and you go out of alignment with your intuition. And that's probably one of the hardest things at a certain degree. Being human, you expect other people to wrong you. You put yourself out there, you're going to get hurt eventually by someone, whether it's ill intended or not.
Mhm.
But nothing is a harder process than when you abandon yourself because that's the one person you have till you die is yourself.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, I am curious about one little thing because there is a piece that I feel we have not touched upon your story,
Yeah.
and that is your good friend Willie, not only the dog, but the actual person that inspired the name.
Um,
And I was curious if they made the book at all or honorable mentions within it.
they did not. They did not, and I'm slightly embarrassed. So thank you for asking about that. Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually gonna go thank you. I'm actually gonna go put him in the dedication. Um Sorry, bud. I'm feeling a little ashamed here. I can't believe.
No,
Yeah.
I would like to say before you talk about the backstory to it, don't feel ashamed. I think
Yeah.
to me, when you said no, it more so felt like that's like your little piece you kept close to your heart. And it's
Mm,
like your one piece that's like, this is mine. And it's
yeah.
okay to have things that belong to you. You're exposing a lot within the book, and it's okay to have your one thing that's like, this is my
Yeah.
little sanctuary, if you will. But go
Yeah.
ahead if you would like to talk about that question.
I would. So there was a friend of ours. He, yeah, I'll use his. I don't usually use people's real names, but he feels okay with it. Yeah, my dad had a good friend named Bill, and Bill, God, he was just a character. Like when you just meet an older guy that you just love, and um he would go on trail. Like he was just a freaking character. And then he also like, I don't know, he had like a permanent like egg stuck on his head. Like he had got injured. And so when he'd take his hat off, he had like a permanent goose egg on his forehead. And so he's already a character. He's kind of got a crooked smile, like an old cowboy you would just see, kind of a John Wayne type, like just kind of crooked smile, just a goofy guy. And he was a really good friend of my dad's, but he was also a really good friend of Todd's. He'd known him and Todd had started some horses together. Like sometimes Bill would just randomly stop by the barn just to BS with Todd, talk horses, talk all these other things. And so when I had said I was assaulted, he was the person I'd worried about most as far as not believing me. I thought he would take Todd's side. And there was a part of me that was heartbroken because I really, he'd go riding with us and he was just a cool dude. Um, he didn't he didn't bat an eye. My before like small town stuff, like before it broke in the paper, because at the time I was the only lesson kid there, so anyone that could put two and two together when the police or the arrest report would have got put in the paper, and him being an elderly guy, he got the paper every week. So he would have put two and two together. And so my dad went to go talk to him about it before it broke into the paper. And he did not hesitate for a second. Like my dad was kind of upset about it. We love this guy, but there was also an understanding of like, this guy has been your friend way longer than we have. And the first thing he said is, I am sick to my stomach because I have watched girls go in and out of that barn for years. And he's like, not to take anything away from Michaela, but there's no way she's the first one. And that was kind of the thing. I think when someone can say it and put the words to it, I think that the dominoes kind of fell into place. And so he passed away when I was 13. So I was still going through the court trials when he passed away. And he was like the first person I was somewhat close to that had passed away. Like by the grace of God, in my younger years, I didn't have a lot of tragic my animals were the hardest deaths that I had experienced in my youth. I didn't have a lot of close people pass away because, like I said, my grandparents, all but one had already passed. And then my grandma didn't pass till I was 17. So, like, at that time, I hadn't had any humans close to me. So, he was the first person that died that I cried over. And so, he passed when I was 13. I remember getting the call that he had passed. And one of the reasons we loved him is he had this little dog. Like my sister just didn't like talking to anybody, but she would only talk to him if she could like pet his dog. And so there was kind of this thing with Bill and his dog. Like Bill was never he never didn't have his dog. His dog's name was Levi. Like, but it was also funny seeing this big old man with this like little Chihuahua type dog. And the Chihuahua was just always in his pickup with him. And then he also had this like troll. I'm telling you, this guy was a character. He also had this troll doll, like always in the back seat of his pickup. And it's just like, here comes Bill, this big old burly guy with his little dog and his troll doll. Like it's just hilarious. And so my dad ended up buying his pickup from him from his wife when he passed away. Like it was kind of this thing we always wanted of Bill to remember him by. Like, he'd pull up in his Dodge and he'd always give my dad crap for driving Fords. And so he'd pull up. So anyway, dad bought his truck and we're cleaning out his truck and we didn't know he was in the military. And so we're cleaning out his truck and we find his dog tags and his name wasn't actually Bill, it was Willard. And yeah, it was Willard F. And I won't say his last name, but he had a goofy last name. It this isn't his last name, but let's just say it rhymed with donkey. So like, it's just goofy name. And so then I got Willie, my Willie, when I nine? I was 18 turning 19. And I like Willie was with me for like 4 or 5 days and did not have a name. I didn't know what to name him. And I was like, I really would love to name him after Bill because he 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 believed me from the start. And he really had, I think maybe this is where intuition comes in because I don't care what men say. Men have really awesome intuition. It's different than women's, but I've seen men with some crazy and like instincts. They'd probably call it more instincts than intuition, but that would probably be the piece they wanted to name him. And I did write this in the book at some point, so I wonder what happened to it. Like for the man who he didn't hesitate for a moment to believe me. And so there was this. yeah, just this, you know, I just cherished him. I really did. Just, he abandoned a 40, 50 year long friendship without hesitation. Like, I don't even think he,
Mm.
like, Todd had tried to call him to, like, basically get him on his side. And he's like, I have nothing to say to you. And what I do have to say to you, you don't want to hear. And he hung up on him, you know? And so it was just like, yeah, no, so yeah, but I was like, I'm not going to name my dog Bill. Like, and so I was like, but I would name him Willard. And at the time, I also loved the remake of Footloose. And Willard, played by Miles Teller, who's also in Top Gun, was playing Willard. And like, I just love the energy that comes with the name Willard. And so that's how Willie got his name.
Yeah, I've heard this story before, but it's still like I'm getting, goosebumps and tears just hearing it again. And I think before I hadn't really noticed, but it is interesting the parallel. This is where God comes into play, and I've always thought God has a funny sense of humor because we talked about hatred and anger, and it's like having that not only towards men, but this very specific version of a man, a cowboy at the least, and then having the complete polar opposite, but same person, same aesthetic, same style, same background, upbringing, another cowboy, do the complete opposite of like believe you without a questionable doubt and
Mhm.
abandon a friendship that he's had for longer. It's like it's a sense of relief because you have this whole town who's going against you and
Mhm.
ostracizing a 12 to 14-year-old girl, and then
Mhm.
you have one savior on a white horse, so to say, which I know you and I have certain emotions towards that, like
Yeah. Yeah.
needing saving, but it also being this old school cowboy. um God has a funny sense of humor, and I think the
Mhm.
key takeaway from that is not to put someone in a box just because someone who appears a certain way does you wrong doesn't mean you should generalize that whole archetype and say they're all one way.
Mhm. Yeah. And when I did what I referenced in April of 2019, I called it like my sexual assault awareness project. I would write my captions the day of. And so it was kind of interesting because I was always surprised at what I would say God would bring to me to write. Um, Again, like some of this, there's certain things I take credit for. I'm like, nah, I wrote that. Like, but there's certain things I'm like, I translated that, or, I typed that. And I remember at the time, this was kind of when things were on the rise of men being falsely accused. And in our culture, it was on the rise to be men haters, like straight white men or the menace of society. And like I
Mhm.
said, I did see those parallels at the time. I saw this, uh, I know most men would not use the term for Todd as man, but we're going to call him a man. So I had Todd, this cowboy man, and then I also had Bill, this other cowboy man. And I saw the difference in the two, and I knew there was a difference in the two. And so I think the last post I wrote for the sexual assault awareness, and this one will make it probably in the second book, but it was a man defended me in the courtroom, a man took my
Mhm.
case, um, a man believed me and abandoned a friendship. And then a man taught me how to love and trust again. Cause really, and this is more in the second book where I talk about, you know who I'm talking about, but his name in the book is Luke. Do you know who I'm talking about? Yeah,
Mhm.
okay. I figured. And then at that point I had dated Luke, and even though him and I didn't work out, like he showed me the reason I believed Allison's work when I read it, because I read Allison's work 5, 6 months after Luke and I had quit talking. Um, the reason I believed the words she was saying was because I had met and got to know Luke, and I saw this be like that was a big parallel for me as well, was like all those beliefs we were talking about that were formed in childhood of boys are dumb, men are shallow, like all of these things. Luke shattered every one of those beliefs for me because I had like the first night I met Luke, he tried to protect me from like I remember I didn't really realize I was but in the book some random guy tried to come up to the door and get in and he like got all I remember like watching him from the passenger seat because I'm like I didn't think it was a big deal like some homeless dude was trying he's like man I thought I was gonna have to kick that guy's ass for a minute I'm like is he trying to protect me I'm like that's weird
Mhm.
and then 5 6 months later I read Allison's work and I was like whoa so anyway I like had all of these things happening I've had these parallels and so the last line was like a man taught me to love and trust again which was Luke 2 men molested me. And like out of all of these other men that had came to my rescue that had come to save me, always outweighed the quote unquote men who did me wrong. And in
Mhm.
fact, and this is not taking anything from away from women because our relationship and our friendship dynamic has helped me immensely. Like whenever you and I learn about something new, it's like, can we practice with each other? Like, and even you and I've talked about when I go to do something big or scary, when your ego gets in or whatever, it's like, Kenley still loves you, Michaela. It's fine. Like, you're not going to lose love if you do this because you have Kenley's love or, their relationship. And so not to take anything away from women because I've had to work through my wounds with women, the mother wound, the feminine wound. I've had to work through all of those. But as far as from the sexual trauma, what's brought me the most healing is all of these men who have helped me, who have. And so that's one thing I always hope to highlight when I'm talking about this stuff is yes, I had 2 men that created very perverted acts that did things we pray don't happen in our society, but they do. And then I also had way more men come to my rescue and were there for me and defended me from these other men, protected me from these other men. And so that's part of our problem with this cultural stuff of putting stereotypes on one another. It's like, okay, for what one person does doesn't make the whole group wrong. And to think all men are bad or all women are good, it's just the most bananas thing. And it's like, I've had wounds from women. I've had wounds from men. Guess what? Men have wounds from me. Women have wounds from me. Like we're not always the
Mhm.
hero and we're not always the villain, but we are the villain for some people and we are the hero for other people. And it's really this book has allowed me to own both where I've done because like there's some stuff I talk about with Luke now knowing like the stuff from Allison like I have emasculated men right like I didn't want to didn't intend to but that was the side effect of it and it's not to beat myself up but it's like no I was the villain in these stories I'd love to really be the hero in the next one so like what behaviors do we need to shift and so yeah thank you for pointing that out because even back then it was like yeah I had this traumatic experience with Todd. But then, here comes Willard to save the day, which it's kind of funny that we talk about that because, my dog Willard has, done so much for me and brought so much healing to me of, loyalty and unconditional love. And even on the days that I'm going crazy and it's like, you're like, yeah, it's a dog. It's like we can learn a lot from pets, if we allow. And it's like, you know, this Willard is my savior on my white horse in a lot of ways too,
Yeah. I think that's one of the biggest things that our friendship has helped me achieve is that understanding that, just because someone wrongs you, I've done a lot of development and growth when it comes to relationship with men. Um,
Mhm.
my own background being a very strong sense of lack of trust within men, and everyone's out to hurt you, and they're not there to protect you. They're there to harm you. There's always a danger undertone to it. And that's one thing that you have taught me, as well as we have learned together and grown that understanding. And I have no doubt that, like, your book, as you continue to expand on it in the other two parts, will only help grow other people's understanding, or I hope that it'll only help grow others' understanding that men, the mass majority of them, are there to protect and provide and assist and even come to the saving if requested upon. But the hardest thing, the biggest barrier between that is just that requesting it, you know.
And allowing it. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there was this moment um I talk about with Luke because again, like he shattered my beliefs about men, just by being a man. You know, and I was packing, it was like the last big horse show that I did. And I was packing my saddle and he had pulled up he had just gotten off work and he had pulled into my house because we were supposed to go do something. I was late packing and I said, "Hey, would you mind just coming hanging out with me at the house while I'm packing because da 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 da." And I was so the type of horses I show is called cutting horses. If you're watching on video, there's a image of the background of one of the greatest horses of all times, but the saddles are big and the saddles are heavy. And so the way I like to carry the saddle is I put it on my hip and then I just kind of wrap my arm around the horn or the cantle or the cannel's in the back, I think, whatever that thing's called. I don't know. It's like you've done it for so long. I'm like, I don't know terminology. Like, so yeah. So I carry the saddle like that. And so I was carrying my saddle like here on my hip. And then I had, because it's like even packing horse trailers, it's very much like when you're carrying groceries in from the grocery store. It's like we're making one trip, like as much as we can. So I've got my saddle and then I've got a bag in my other hand. And Luke pulls up and was like, "Can I take that for you?" And I was like, "I got it." Like, because the script in my head from my family beliefs and like all of these other things was men don't want a high maintenance woman. Um, Basically be a strong, independent woman. Don't let a man help you, like all of these things. And so the other thing about my saddle is when it gets on my hip, like it's pretty snug there. Like my hip just happens. So it's like once I get it on there, I don't really want to take it off. And so he's like, "Can I grab that for you?" And I was like, "No, I got it." And I remember out of the corner of my eye, I watched his shoulders slump. And so even though like after
Mm-hmm.
reading Allison's book, I didn't have this lingo, I know body language because with horses, that's all you have is body language. So I know body language, I know how to watch it. And so I'm like, did he just slump his shoulder? Like I'm 19, right? And I'm like, did he just slump his I'm like, does he want to help me? Like, what is this? And so I give him this bag, which in a way is really emasculating, right? Because I'm like carrying this 50-pound saddle and I give him this 2-pound bag to carry. Like I know nothing. And but I wouldn't allow help. And it's funny because a few days later, because I started packing the trailer a few days, the jacks on my trailer had broke. And at the time, I'd asked my mom's boyfriend to fix them. And Luke and I are going to the mall to pick up some jeans. This is all in the second book. And I was and side note, it might be the sneak peek in the first book. It is the sneak peek in the first. So he's fixing my trailer or my mom's boyfriend's fixing the trailer. Luke and I are going to the mall. He's like, "I thought you didn't like that guy." I'm like, "I can't stand that fucking guy." And he's like, "Why did you ask him to fix your trailer?" I'm like, "Because my mom and I are basically at war because I can't stand this guy." And I make it very well known that I don't like my mom's boyfriend because he's just that'll be in the third book. He was just awful. But I'm like, I'm trying to make some peace here because being at war within your own home is just awful. So I thought
Mhm.
that maybe him helping would break the ice, if you will. And so, because at this point, I'm like, my mom apparently is not getting rid of this guy. So I'll just make the peace. So I'm like explaining all this to Luke. And he's like, "Why didn't you ask me to fix the jacks?" And I can't stand women who use men. Even back then, I couldn't stand women who use men just for like, "Oh, will you do this for me? Will you do that for me?" But they don't care for them. They're just trying to get stuff done because they don't want to do it. I can't stand that. And I never wanted Luke to feel that way. And so I explained this to him. I was like, I can't stand. I was like, I've had a couple women in my immediate family. They don't care about their men. They don't care about this. And they use them. And I never want you to feel that way with me. And I remember he looked at me. He's like, one, I don't think you could ever do that. And he was like, 2, I want to help you. And he starts explaining like all of this stuff. I'm like, you want to help? Like, what? And so, ironically enough, my mom's boyfriend did not fix the jacks. Like, he fixed them temporarily, but then they broke again once we got the truck on the trailer. So Luke ended up fixing the jacks anyway. um, so I had that story in my head, and like 8 months later, I'm reading Allison's book. And so again, I have this, I'm like, no, men want to help, but I had been raised to be a strong, independent woman, to
Mhm.
not be perceived as weak, like all of these beliefs. And then on top of that, I don't want Luke to think I'm using him. And so then it was a very interesting, like him and I had that conversation, we had that dynamic. And then I read these books and I was like, holy crap, my whole perception has been wrong. And so it's really been an interesting, like, thank you for, getting on here and talking about all this stuff. Cause when it comes all together, the family stuff, the sexual assault stuff, but then I felt like that was the second book doesn't start with Luke. It starts with the Luke story, which is titled 19 right now. But I thought it was a good, I think everyone's kind of a sucker for a love story. And, it's like teen love,
Mhm.
which is just, I think, at its purest for a lot of reasons. So, yeah, that is the sneak peek. In the back of the book is um, my time with Luke.
Yeah, and I think you and I both have that shared common belief of like, I don't want to use men. I don't want to
Hmm.
ask for help for something that I can do for myself.
Hmm.
But as Allison reveals to us, they want to help. And as you observed with Luke and how the way his shoulders slumped and reading that body language, like it very much so the rejection of help goes well beyond just the task that's before you. It goes into their exact purpose in life. Imagine depriving someone of their purpose in life. Um, and learning that, I think the key factor in what Luke was alluding to when he said, I don't see you ever doing that, is you had only known women who did not care for the men asking for help. But when you're a woman who uh, genuinely cares for the men, and not even just talking about a relationship, but I've noticed in platonic friendships and relationships, when you show genuine care and ask questions about someone and then you ask them for help, for a man, that's like everything that he could ask for. You'll just see them light up
Hmm.
and genuinely look forward to interacting with you. A man wants to be in the presence of a feminine woman. And the best way to attain that is have genuine care and allow them to help you. As hard as that
Hmm.
sounds. So as long as that's
Yeah.
there, I think that you will never touch on what you wanted to steer away from that your family has done in the past. And knowing you, I don't think you have it in you to ask anyone for help that you don't genuinely care for because you are such a genuine soul. Um, and that being said, I wanted to ask, is there anything that we didn't touch on for the book that you would like to highlight now?
I think this was fun. And what I actually really want to tell people is, and you and I had talked on the phone because you were like, is there anything you want to cover? Is there anything you don't want to cover? And I was like, actually, I really want it to be a surprise. Like, I don't want
Yeah.
anything to be scripted. I don't want anything to be planned. Like, I just, and actually, what's interesting is you haven't read the whole book. And what I told
Mhm.
Kenley, because she was like, I haven't read it. And I was like, but you know me and you know my story. And I actually want to see just where it'll go. And it was like so much better than I could have even thought of. So, I mean, thank you. I don't think, like I said, when the book is officially published, I'm going to record the introduction and read a little bit of the book. And then we're just going to go right in this conversation. This was fun. I mean, there were so many things I just never expected us to talk about that I don't know that I've ever talked about. So no, thank you. I freaking crushed it, Kenley Ty.
Well, thank you. I was nervous. And I want to say, my intention is to read the book the time in which Michaela had sent over the pilot book, if that's what I can call it.
Yeah.
My job, my work within the Marine Corps is kind of at the time reviewing and reading and almost doing the editing of papers to an extent. That's what I do all day long. So when I sat down to read the pilot book, I could tell my editing mind was on, and that is not the energy I wanted to bring to the table when reading a friend's book. I did not want to be there with a red pen ready to highlight and correct. I very much so wanted to be a reader and someone who is ingesting the information rather than editing. And so that's why I had to put the book down and step away. But I'm very excited for the finished book and can't wait to sit down with it and spend some time with my best friend on paper.
I know. Well, and to be fair, like with everything happening for a reason, I feel like this was better having you not read the book in a lot of ways. Like our conversation today, I feel like not that it would have been bad had you read it all together, but I also feel like there was a reason that I don't know. I think it was just fun talking to a friend about my story. I mean, really,
It
like book
was.
or not. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think we nailed it. I mean, do you have any other last I we crushed it. Well, my friends, thank you so much for listening to that episode with my friend Kenley Tai and myself. I hope you enjoyed listening to that episode as much as I enjoyed recording it. If you have not done so yet, please subscribe to the show. And the barn off of Colfax Lane can be purchased below in the show notes, or if you head over to Amazon. Thank you, take care, and we will talk to you soon.